Welcome to the deep dive, and a very special welcome back, everyone, to our Congress in Context series. Today, we're taking a much closer, updated look at a piece of legislation that, well, it just keeps evolving. H.R. 1, officially known, perhaps a bit ambitiously, as the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. If you were with us for our previous deep dive on H.R. 1, think of this as your crucial update. We're charting its really quite tumultuous journey through Capitol Hill. So let's begin unpacking this thing. This isn't just, any old bill. It's a truly sweeping legislative effort. It's technically a budget reconciliation bill, and it already passed the House way back on May 22, 2025. And it touches almost every corner of federal policy. We're talking higher education, healthcare, taxation, even critical social safety net programs. It's huge. It seems designed not just to tweak things around the edges, but to fundamentally reshape how the federal government operates and, importantly, how it funds itself. It really feels like a significant challenge to the status quo.
Right. And what's particularly striking here is precisely how it's designed to do, that you mentioned it, through the budget reconciliation process. This procedural mechanism, it's immensely powerful because it allows a bill like this to pass the Senate with just a simple majority. So it essentially sidesteps the usual 60-vote threshold that you need to overcome a filibuster. This means legislation as broad and impactful as H.R. 1 can potentially move forward even with very, very close margins in the Senate. But, and this is a big but, it's not a free pass for just any policy. Reconciliation bills have to adhere strictly to something called the Byrd Rule. And that rule basically dictates that all the provisions, everything in the bill, must have a direct and measurable impact on federal spending or revenue. That's a critical limitation. It means that while the bill is sweeping, its contents are ultimately constrained by these fiscal considerations, which makes its policy choices all the more, well, deliberate and significant.
Indeed. That bird rule is always hovering, isn't it? And for you, our listener, especially if you recall our previous deep dive on H.R. 1, this update is crucial because the bill has gone from that initial version that passed the House to now facing some truly distinct and frankly often competing proposals cropping up in the Senate, particularly from key committee leaders like Senator Rand Paul and Senator Lindsey Graham. It's definitely not a straight line from the House to the president's desk for this one. Not at all. This is shaping up to be a real legislative battle, with internal divisions, even within the same party. And the outcome, whatever it is going to define key aspects of American life for years to come.
Absolutely. And it would connect this to the bigger picture. It just highlights the immense complexities of, well, negotiating between the House and Senate and the art of political compromise, or maybe in this case, the lack of it, at least in these early Senate stages. The journey of H.R. 1 really showcases the huge challenges in trying to enact such broad, sweeping legislation, especially when different factions, even within the same, ideological camp, have really divergent priorities. Its final form, whatever it ends up being, is going to have profound and lasting impacts across the nation. It'll touch millions of lives, students hoping for an education, federal employees serving the public, low-income families relying on safety nets. It really is a high-stakes legislative gamble.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning, or at least the beginning of this current phase. H.R. 1 as it left the House. It's important to remember it passed by a razor-thin margin, 215 to 214 votes, back on May 22, 2025. That slim margin alone tells you this was highly contentious, pretty partisan right from the get-go. And here's another crucial detail. The version that passed wasn't even the first draft. It was already an evolved version of earlier House proposals. It had gone through its own internal revisions, compromises, which really signals that even just within the House, getting to this point was a significant legislative heavy lift.
Right, and this immediately raises a key question. What were the core components of this initial framework that the House managed to agree on, even narrowly? It signals a pretty clear, maybe even aggressive intent to reshape federal spending and revenue. We're moving beyond just minor adjustments here. This is looking like a fundamental overhaul of key federal programs and tax policies. The sheer breadth of the bill, combined with how narrowly it passed, really underscores the deep ideological divides that are at play.
All right, let's dig into the first big area, higher education. For students and families across the country, this next part is potentially a real game changer. The House bill proposes truly significant changes to federal higher education policy, a lot of it aimed at student aid and institutional accountability. For instance, right off the bat, it eliminates Pell Grants for part-time students. Now, this isn't just about cutting costs, is it? It feels like it's fundamentally redefining who gets federal support for higher education. I mean, think about the immediate, tangible impact this could have on working adults trying to upskill, or parents or anyone with family responsibilities who relies on part-time enrollment. This could just mean fewer opportunities for a whole group of people to access higher education.
Exactly. And what's particularly striking about these changes is the kind of philosophical pivot they represent. Historically, federal student aid programs like Pell Grants, subsidized loans, they were designed to broaden access, to ensure that financial barriers didn't stop people from going to college.
Right.
This bill, however, it signals a move towards viewing higher education more like a market, where institutions have to bear more financial risk, and federal support becomes less of a universal safety net and more maybe a targeted investment. It reflects a broader trend, perhaps, of shifting federal responsibilities back onto individuals and states. And beyond Pell, the bill also sunsets subsidized loans for undergraduates. That's huge. And it entirely terminates the grad PLUS loan program. So that's removing crucial federal support mechanisms for student borrowing. Yeah. It means significantly less direct federal financial aid available, period. And it doesn't stop there. They impose strict limits on parent PLUS loans, too, capping them at $50,000 aggregate per parent borrower. Now, for many families, especially those maybe with multiple kids in college or kids pursuing expensive programs, that could create substantial financial gaps, potentially forcing students into riskier private loans or maybe even pricing them out of college altogether.
And they're not just tweaking the loans themselves, right? There's a major overhaul of the repayment plans, too. Existing popular plans like Pay As You Earn, Pay E, and Saving on a Valuable Education, Save E, those are just outright repealed, gone. In their place, two new options emerge. A new income contingent repayment plan and just a standard 10-year repayment plan, both effective July 1st, 2026. What does that actually mean for borrowers? It feels like a loss of flexibility, maybe higher payments.
It certainly could mean that, a loss of the flexibility and often the more generous terms of the current income-driven repayment plans, which could potentially lead to higher monthly payments and maybe longer repayment periods for many people.
Right. And on top of that, new caps on borrowing altogether.
Yes. New caps on student loan borrowing. $150,000 for graduate and professional students, and an overall lifetime limit of $200,000 per borrower.
Those are pretty firm ceilings.
They are. And they could disproportionately affect students in longer programs, like medical school or law school or anyone pursuing advanced degrees. It could potentially make those paths financially unfeasible for some.
And there was something else fundamental changing, too, about how need is calculated.
Yes, that's perhaps one of the most fundamental shifts here. How student need would actually be calculated for federal financial aid. The bill mandates the use of the median cost of college on a program-by-program basis. What this means, in practical terms, is that the amount of need the federal government calculates. It won't necessarily cover the full sticker price of education for about half of the institutions nationwide. So students are left with a larger gap to fill through other means: private loans, more work, increased family contributions.
Okay. And then there's this risk-sharing idea.
Right, the new risk-sharing model. This is a significant departure. It requires colleges to financially contribute if their former students default on their loans. The example given was the University of Colorado system potentially facing over $8 million annually in these contributions. Now, the idea is to hold institutions more accountable for student outcomes, for job placement, for earnings. But the reality for many colleges, especially smaller ones or those serving lower income populations, could just be increased financial pressure.
Okay, so let's pull back for a second. If we look at all these higher ed pieces together, what does it all mean? What's the big picture here for the future of higher education in America? These feel like massive shifts.
They really are. This policy direction represents a profound ideological shift, away from that traditional focus on broad-based access and affordability. Federal student aid historically aimed to ensure financial barriers didn't stop students. This bill, though, it's very fiscally conservative in its approach. It emphasizes institutional accountability, yes, but it also significantly limits the federal government's financial exposure. The consequences could be quite dire. Reduced access, particularly for low-income and non-traditional students. Increased financial burdens on those who do manage to enroll. And institutions. They might be forced to raise tuition to cover costs or these new risk-sharing penalties, or cut programs, or maybe become more selective in admissions to try and mitigate default risks. In the long run, you could see a less diverse student body nationally and just a higher barrier to entry for many aspiring students. It would fundamentally alter the landscape of federal student aid and institutional financial responsibility for years, maybe decades to come.
All right, let's pivot to healthcare. The bill proposes equally significant alterations here, particularly impacting Medicaid, which is, the nation's largest public health insurance program. It starts, interestingly, with a moratorium on new or increased provider taxes. Can you unpack that a bit? What are provider taxes and why does this matter?
Sure. So provider taxes are fees that states levy on healthcare providers, like hospitals or nursing homes. The states use that revenue, and this is the key part, to draw down matching federal funds for their Medicaid programs. It's a critical funding mechanism for many states. This moratorium, by blocking new or increased taxes, directly constrains the state's ability to fund their share of Medicaid. It forces them to find alternative revenue sources, which is hard, or more likely, to cut services, reduce payments to doctors and hospitals, or tighten eligibility. It's essentially a direct federal intervention into state-level healthcare financing, and it puts significant pressure on state budgets, especially those that expanded Medicaid.
Okay, so it hits state funding. But this brings up that critical question. How else does the House bill impact eligibility and enrollment for people on Medicaid?
Right, it tackles that directly, too. It implements mandatory work requirements for able-bodied adults without dependents, meaning these individuals would need to prove they are working or volunteering or in job training for a certain number of hours each month to keep their benefits. It also mandates more frequent eligibility checks for people enrolled through the Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act. And it introduces cost-sharing things like premiums or co-pays for this expansion population as well. Yeah. All of this is set to take effect by December 31st, 2026.
These aren't minor tweaks, then?
Not at all. These are structural changes really designed to reduce the number of people on Medicaid, often by creating, frankly, administrative hurdles or adding financial burdens that make it harder for people to enroll or stay enrolled.
And I remember seeing something about funding for states covering undocumented immigrants.
Yes. There's a reduction in the Enhanced Federal Medical Assistance Percentage, the FMAP, for states covering certain lawfully present immigrants, actually. It drops to the federal match rate. So states that use their own funds to cover these populations will receive less federal reimbursement, essentially penalizing them for providing that coverage.
Got it. Okay.
And then there are the community engagement requirements you mentioned earlier. This is a truly striking aspect. The Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, estimates this provision alone would reduce federal Medicaid outlays by an astounding $344 billion over 10 years, from fiscal year 2025 to 2034.
$344 billion, just from that one provision.
Just from that one. And that's not just a number on a spreadsheet. It translates, according to the CBO, into a projected 4.8 million people losing health insurance coverage by fiscal year 2034.
Wow, 4.8 million people.
It's a staggering human impact, potentially reversing years of gains we've seen in health coverage. The bill also, very explicitly, prohibits using federal Medicaid and Children's Health Insurance Program, CHIP funds, for gender transition procedures. And it also bars funding for certain Medicaid reproductive health care providers. So these aren't just fiscal changes. They are direct dictates on what types of health care federal Medicaid funds can support, reflecting, a deeper cultural and ideological stance on these issues.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture again, these Medicaid provisions, they aren't just fiscal adjustments, are they? They seem to fundamentally change the social contract of Medicaid.
That's a good way to put it. They really do. They will likely lead to a substantial increase in the uninsured population across the country. They could exacerbate existing health disparities, particularly in rural areas, or for specific demographic groups who rely heavily on Medicaid. And they'll place immense financial strain on state budgets, especially for those states that did expand Medicaid under the ACA. And think about the healthcare providers, particularly hospitals in underserved or rural areas. This could mean even greater challenges for them to remain viable. Ultimately, it affects access to care for the most vulnerable populations and could potentially lead to more hospital closures, particularly in rural America.
Okay, let's unpack the tax policy adjustments now. These seem quite multifaceted in the House bill, sort of a complex interplay of different objectives. What's going on here?
It's definitely a mix. On the one hand, it increases the unrelated business income tax, or UBT, on nonprofits. Specifically, it targets things like qualified transportation fringe benefits provided to employees and certain executive compensation. This essentially reinstates a tax burden on nonprofits for these activities, something that was actually repealed back in 2019.
So bring back an old tax on nonprofits.
Exactly. It also introduces a tax on income from non-public research conducted by tax-exempt organizations, meaning scientific research income would only remain exempt if the findings are made publicly available. This could discourage certain types of proprietary research within universities or research institutions.
And then there's the energy piece. What's happening with clean energy tax credits?
Yeah, this is a key takeaway. The bill explicitly phases out some of the clean energy tax credits that were established or expanded in the Inflation Reduction Act. It also rescinds $400 million from the Department of Energy's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. So it's a pretty clear signal of a shift away from supporting renewable energy and perhaps implicitly towards more traditional energy sectors.
Okay. And what about that endowment tax on universities?
Right. It expands the endowment excise tax that currently applies to some private nonprofit higher education institutions. The existing 1.4% tax would be replaced with a new tiered system. It could reach as high as 21% for institutions with a student-adjusted endowment exceeding $2 million per student. And significantly, the definition of net investment income subject to the tax would now include interest earned on student loans held by the institution. This places a potentially significant new financial burden on well-endowed educational institutions. It could impact their ability to fund scholarships, research, faculty salaries, you name it.
Okay, so that's taxes on certain organizations. But this brings an important question to mind. What about individual taxpayers? You know, the average American family trying to make ends meet. Is there anything for them?
Yes, there is. And this is where the bill provides some significant relief. It extends many of the expiring provisions from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the TCJA, of 2017. Remember, many of those individual tax cuts were set to expire at the end of 2025. So this bill extends things like the reduced individual income tax rates and the increased standard deduction. Crucially, it also expands the child tax credit, making it fully refundable and providing it through advanced monthly payments.
Ah, the monthly payments. People remember those.
Exactly. And it also increases the Earned Income Tax Credit, or EITC, and expands its age eligibility.
So for many families, particularly those with children, this looks like a direct tax break and increased support.
Definitely. And for small businesses, too, there's a change. It replaces the existing 199A deduction, that's the qualified business income deduction, with a flat $25,000 deduction on qualifying business income. Though that deduction does phase out for higher earners. Plus, and this is a big one for working parents, it permanently restores the improvements made to the Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit back in 2021.
Remind us what those improvements were.
They significantly raised the maximum amount of expenses eligible for the credit and the percentage you could claim. So the maximum credit would jump back up from around $1,050 to $4,000 for one child, and from $2,100 to $8,000 for two or more children.
Wow, that's a substantial boost.
It really is a substantial boost for families struggling with childcare expenses. It could potentially ease a major financial burden for millions of working parents.
Okay, so if we look at the whole tax package now, what does this all mean? For the economy, for different sectors, it really feels like a push and pull, giving breaks here, adding taxes there.
That's a good description. The package demonstrates a clear intent to provide broad tax relief to individuals and families. That could potentially boost consumer spending and provide direct help, especially to those with children. But simultaneously, it broadens the tax base or increases revenue from entities that were previously exempt or taxed less, like those large university endowments or certain nonprofit activities. And, as we noted, it disincentivizes clean energy investment while potentially favoring traditional energy. So it suggests a kind of recalibration of economic incentives, favoring individual tax relief and maybe certain traditional business sectors while increasing financial obligations for nonprofits and directly reducing support for renewable energy development. This could lead to a redistribution of wealth and resources, impacting the operational capacity of nonprofits, shifting research priorities away from proprietary work, and potentially slowing the transition to a green economy as those incentives change.
All right, let's move on to social programs. The bill proposes equally significant changes here, especially hitting the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNP, which most people know as food stamps. What's happening with SNOP?
Well, first, it completely eliminates the SNAP Nutrition Education Program, known as SNAP-Ed, run by the Department of Agriculture. That's the program designed to help recipients make healthier food choices on a budget.
Okay, so education funding cut. What else?
Beyond that, it expands the population subject to, frankly, burdensome paperwork requirements related to work hours. It expands it to include families with children as young as 10 years old. This means more families, even those with relatively young children, could lose benefits simply for not meeting administrative paperwork rules or work hour requirements, regardless of their actual need for food assistance.
And then there's the cost-sharing piece. That sounds major.
It is. This is one of the most impactful provisions. It implements significant cost sharing for states, requiring states to pay up to 25% of the actual SNAP benefits distributed in their state, plus 75% of the administrative expenses for running the program.
Wow, 25% of the benefits. That's huge.
It's a massive shift. Currently, the federal government covers 100% of the benefits. The Congressional Budget Office estimates this change alone could lead to 1.3 million people, including children, losing benefits in an average month. Why? Because it places such enormous financial stress on state budgets, forcing them to make incredibly difficult choices about funding the program or cutting eligibility. It shifts a massive financial burden directly onto the states, many of which, as you know, are already stretched pretty thin financially.
And this is where it gets particularly concerning. I think you mentioned these ripple effects. The SNFP cuts extend far beyond just food assistance, right?
Exactly. The consequences cascade. Estimates suggest that 37% of children and pregnant women currently enrolled in Head Start and Early Head Start programs could lose access to these critical early education services.
Why? How are they connected?
Often because their eligibility for Head Start is directly tied to their family's receipt of SNAP benefits. If they lose SNAP, they might automatically lose Head Start too.
Okay, wow. That's a huge unintended consequence.
Or perhaps intended, depending on the perspective. And if that wasn't enough, CDO also projected that at least 16 million students are at risk of losing access to free school meal programs.
16 million. How does that connect?
Because SNAP participation data is often used in formulas that determine eligibility for free meals or trigger higher federal reimbursements for school meal programs under provisions like the Community Eligibility Provision. Fewer families on SNAP could mean fewer kids automatically eligible for free lunch and less funding for schools serving low-income areas.
So the impact just keeps spreading. It's not just about putting food on the table. It's hitting early childhood development, basic nutrition for millions of school kids.
Right. And this immediately raises that crucial question. What are the broader long-term consequences of such deep cuts to a program like SNAP? These provisions aren't just about achieving immediate budget savings on paper. They represent a kind of systemic dismantling of a critical social safety net that has been a cornerstone for decades. While they achieve those immediate fiscal goals, they risk pushing millions of individuals and families into greater food insecurity. They risk worsening public health outcomes due to malnutrition, particularly among children. And they risk undermining the very human capital healthy, educated kids necessary for future economic growth. There was actually a surprising fact noted in our sources. The societal cost of these cuts is projected to be somewhere between $14 and $20 for every single dollar cut in SNAP benefits. $14 to $20 cost for every dollar saved. How does that work? Through increased healthcare costs later on, lower educational attainment, reduced productivity, increased crime rates, all these long-term economic and social externalities. It indicates potentially severe long-term negative consequences, increased child poverty, reduced academic performance, lower future earnings, ultimately costing society far more than the initial savings achieved by the cuts. #tag made a notable provisions in fiscal reality check.
Okay, wow. So HR1 also touches on a range of other areas too, just showcasing how broad this one big, beautiful bill act truly is. What else stood out?
Well, a couple of interesting things. For instance, it provides $500 million for modernizing artificial intelligence, or AI, capabilities, specifically within the Department of Commerce. But simultaneously, it includes a provision that bans the enforcement of any state and local AI laws for 10 years.
So federal funding for AI, but preempting state regulation of it. That immediately brings up that whole question of federal versus state regulatory power, especially in a field moving as fast as AI.
Exactly. It's a fascinating tension. The bill also includes a production tax credit for unleaded aviation gasoline, avgas, starting at $1.25 per gallon in 2026. That's a very clear financial incentive for a specific industry.
And what about that detail concerning the PCAOB, the Accounting Oversight Board?
Yes, that was a fascinating detail. It includes a delay in transferring the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, the PCAOB, to the SEC. The transfer is delayed until the SEC certifies that retirement savers, think about people with 401ks or IRAs, won't be exposed to greater financial reporting risks because of this bill.
So a pause button on a regulatory change until they're sure it won't hurt retirees.
Precisely. It suggests a surprisingly cautious approach to financial regulatory changes within this otherwise sweeping bill. It prioritizes investor protection, which is quite notable. It highlights that tension between wanting rapid reform and needing to safeguard long-term financial stability.
Okay. And perhaps one of the most critical fiscal measures embedded in this reconciliation bill, and frankly, a very clear and direct one we need to mention, It increases the maximum amount of allowable public debt, the debt ceiling, by a staggering $4 trillion. That isn't just some minor accounting adjustment. It's always a political lightning rod. So bringing it all together, what does this all mean fiscally for the nation, given the sprawling set of changes, cuts here, spending there, tax changes everywhere?
Yeah, if we connect this to the bigger picture, fiscally, despite being a budget reconciliation bill, a process often associated with deficit reduction, HR-1 in its current House-passed form would actually contribute significantly to the national debt. The CBO's own analysis projects a substantial $2.8 trillion increase in the overall deficit over the next 10 years, the 2025-2034 period.
An increase, even with all those cuts we just talked about.
Even with the cuts, it's primarily due to the revenue side. The CBO projects a $3.7 trillion reduction in federal revenues over that period, mainly from the tax cuts. That significantly outweighs the $1.3 trillion reduction in non-interest outlays, the spending cuts. And any positive economic effects generated by the bill, like potential boosts from the tax cuts, are simply insufficient, according to CBO, to offset the increased interest payments the government would have to make on that growing federal debt.
So the debt service costs eat up any growth dividend.
Essentially, yes. This highlights a fundamental tension between the bill's maybe stated objectives and its projected financial outcomes. It really underscores the profound and potentially destabilizing long-term consequences of the bill's design, as passed by the House, for the national debt and overall fiscal sustainability. It definitely sets the stage for future fiscal challenges down the road.
Okay, so that was House version. Passed by one vote, hugely complex, as to the deficit. Then it entered the Senate. And substantial changes were immediately anticipated, as they always are. This is where the intricacies of that budget reconciliation process truly come into play again. As we discussed earlier, every single provision has to directly impact the federal budget. And that determination is made by a nonpartisan referee, the Senate parliamentarian. This critical hurdle often means that even if a bill squeaks through the House, it faces a significant gauntlet in the Senate. Policy details, things that don't have a clear budget impact, can be stripped out based on the parliamentarian's ruling on the Byrd Rule.
Right. And this immediately raises a crucial question. Why did we see not just one Senate response, but two distinctly competing versions emerge at the committee level, specifically from Senator Rand Paul and Senator Lindsey Graham? It strongly signals, well, internal disagreements. A clear lack of unified support for a single approach, even within their own party in the Senate.
So instead of presenting a united front against the House bill or a single alternative, they offered different paths.
Exactly. Instead of a single, coherent Senate proposal, we saw two very different visions emerge from key committees, each with its own priorities, its own areas of focus. It really showcases the complex internal politics that define major legislation like this.
Okay, let's first explore Senator Rand Paul's approach. He's the chairman of the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, and his version of HR-1 really zeroes in on federal employees. This is where it gets particularly insightful, maybe concerning, especially for current and future federal workers. What's really notable, maybe surprising, is that Paul's version omits several significant federal benefit cuts that were explicitly in the House bill, cuts aimed at existing federal employees and retirees. Things like eliminating the FERS annuity supplement or changing the retirement calculation from the best 3 years of salary to the best 5, or increasing retirement contributions for current employees. Paul's version leaves those out.
Right, which looks like a direct protection for those already in the federal system. Perhaps a political calculation aimed at not alienating a large group of current workers and retirees, a key constituency.
Okay, so he protects current workers. There's usually a but.
There is indeed. While protecting current employees, his proposal introduces significant new burdens, primarily targeting the future federal workforce and also federal employee unions. It reflects a much longer-term strategy. For instance, new federal employees hired after the bill passes would face an additional 5% increase in their retirement contributions, on top of the existing 4.4% they already pay.
Wow, a 5% hit right from day one. That's substantial.
It's a substantial financial hit for new hires, absolutely. And this brings an important, maybe even more fundamental question to the forefront. These new employees would also be forced to make a choice. Either accept this additional 5% tax, as Paul frames it, or relinquish their merit-based civil service protections.
Wait, relinquish civil service protections? Can you explain what that means? Those are pretty foundational.
They are the backbone of a professional, nonpartisan government workforce. They ensure federal employees are hired and promoted based on their qualifications, not political connections. And they protect employees from arbitrary dismissal or politically motivated firings. Forcing this choice essentially creates a trade-off: significantly lower take-home pay, or giving up job security and protections that allow civil servants to offer impartial advice or resist political pressure. It potentially allows an administration to more easily replace career civil servants with political appointees, which could fundamentally alter the independence and expertise of federal agencies over time.
Okay, that's a major potential shift. What else is in Paul's version targeting federal workers or their organizations?
Well, his version also retains a provision, likely from earlier drafts, that imposes a filing fee for employees who want to appeal adverse actions to the Merit Systems Protection Board, the MSPB. This could act as a deterrent for employees seeking recourse against unfair treatment, and specifically targeting federal employee organizations, the unions. It would impose a 10% tax or service fee on any union dues that are paid via automatic payroll deduction. And it would require unions to reimburse the government for the use of any government equipment, office space, or even employee time used for union activities during work hours, so-called official time.
So, directly hitting the finances and operations of federal unions.
Clearly seeking to diminish their influence and financial stability, yes.
And there was one more piece in Paul's version that sounded structurally significant.
Yeah.
About presidential power.
Yes. A truly structural and, you might even say audacious, provision here is one that grants the president virtually unchecked authority to reorganize the federal government without needing prior congressional authorization.
Virtually unchecked authority. That sounds expansive. Isn't that usually Congress's job?
Historically, yes. Presidential reorganization powers have generally been limited by Congress, requiring legislative approval for major changes precisely to prevent executive overreach or the politicization of the civil service. Granting virtually unchecked authority could allow an administration to swiftly dismantle or consolidate agencies, shift responsibilities, potentially bypass established procedures, and remove layers of institutional memory and expertise. It could allow an administration to rapidly reshape the entire government apparatus to align with its specific political agenda, bypassing many of the traditional checks and balances provided by Congress.
Okay. So, when we put all of Senator Paul's proposals together, protecting current workers, burdening future ones, weakening unions, expanding presidential power, what does this tell us about the vision for the future of the federal workforce?
Well, it clearly creates a two-tiered system for federal employees, one for current workers, who are largely protected from the most immediate cuts, and another, much less protected and more financially burdened tier for all future hires. It suggests a broader, long-term objective: to diminish the independence and the influence of the career civil service over time, perhaps replacing it with a structure that's more politically malleable, more directly responsive to the president's agenda. If we connect this to the bigger picture, these kinds of changes could lead to a federal workforce that's less experienced, potentially more politically aligned, and maybe less willing or able to provide neutral, expert advice. You could see a decline in institutional expertise and memory, a weakening of that merit-based system that underpins government neutrality. And ultimately, this would impact the efficiency, the effectiveness, and certainly the perceived neutrality of government operations. It could fundamentally reshape how the federal government functions and who works within it for decades to come.
All right. Now let's turn to the other major Senate player here, Senator Lindsey Graham. He's chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, and he released a significantly different version of HR-1. His proposal focuses solely on Homeland Security measures, apparently, and notably omits all those governmental affairs provisions about federal workers that were the absolute core of Senator Paul's bill. So a much narrower scope than Paul's vision, and a clearly different set of priorities being signaled from the Budget Committee.
Exactly. This divergence really highlights fundamentally different priorities within the Senate leadership and maybe different approaches to achieving fiscal conservatism or policy goals through reconciliation. It's an interesting case study in how varied legislative strategies can be, even when potentially aiming for similar broad outcomes like deficit reduction or reshaping government. Let's delve into how Graham's proposal impacts some of those specific policy areas we discussed earlier compared to the House bill.
Okay, starting with Medicaid again. How does Graham's version compare to the House on things like work requirements?
Well, his Senate bill would actually expand the Medicaid work requirement. It would make it apply to parents of teenagers.
Parents of teens. Didn't the House bill specifically exempt parents?
It did. The House bill exempted parents from the work requirements it imposed on other childless adults. So Graham's version stands in direct contradiction here. Estimates suggest this expansion to parents of teens could lead to anywhere from 100,000 to 400,000 additional Medicaid enrollees losing their health coverage.
So potentially hitting families quite hard.
A significant number, yes, especially impacting families trying to balance work, childcare, and potentially elder care as well.
And what about those state provider taxes? Does Graham address those?
He does. And his version actually goes further than the House in restricting how states can tax hospitals and other providers to help fund Medicaid. The House bill just froze provider taxes at their current levels for all states. Graham's version would impose stricter limits, leading to reductions in allowable taxes for the District of Columbia and the 40 states that expanded Medicaid.
So even tighter restrictions on state funding mechanisms. This brings that important question back. What's the likely impact of these stricter limits?
The sources suggest it could lead to significant negative effects, particularly on healthcare access for children in rural communities. And it would certainly increase the financial strain on rural hospitals, which often rely heavily on these provider taxes and the associated federal matching funds to keep their doors open. It could potentially lead to reduced access to care or even more hospital closures in vulnerable, often rural areas.
Okay, let's look at food stamps, SNAP. You said Graham's Senate text makes less drastic changes overall compared to the House bill, at least on the surface. How so?
Well, for example, on that state cost-sharing provision we talked about, the House wanted states to pay 25% of benefits. Graham's version caps the state cost-sharing requirement at 15%.
Okay, 15% instead of 25%. That does sound less drastic for state budgets.
It might seem so, reducing the direct fiscal hit on states compared to the House bill.
I sense another but coming.
Yes. Here's where it gets particularly nuanced and frankly quite impactful in a different way. Graham's bill paradoxically goes further than the House bill on work requirements in one specific area. It does not exempt families where there is one working parent and one stay-at-home parent from the work requirements.
Wait, the House bill did exempt those families.
Our understanding is the House bill focused the requirements more on single individuals or couples where neither worked. Graham's bill appears to remove that specific exemption for single-earner couples with a stay-at-home parent. This means both parents in such a family would potentially need to demonstrate compliance with work requirements to keep their SNAP benefits. Estimates suggest that this specific change could put an estimated 2.5 million children at risk of losing at least some SNAP benefits.
2.5 million kids is from that one change to work rules for two-parent families?
That's the projection. So while the state cost share percentage might seem less drastic on paper, the direct human impact could actually be far greater under Graham's bill due to these stricter work requirements for certain family structures. It could force single-income families into an incredibly difficult position, either compelling the stay-at-home parent into the workforce, potentially before they're ready or childcare is available, or facing the loss of critical food assistance for their children.
Okay. What about firearms policy? Did Graham's version address that?
Yes. His Senate bill retains the House provision that eliminates the $200 federal tax on gun silencers or suppressors and removes them from certain federal tracking requirements under the National Firearms Act.
So he kept the House language on silencers.
He did. But according to our sources, it goes even further. It expands this deregulation, the removal from NFA tracking and taxation, to also include short-barrel rifles, short-barrel shotguns, and potentially other weapons that fall under that NFA category.
So significantly broadening the scope of firearms deregulation beyond just silencers.
That appears to be the case. It's not just about specific weapon types. It reflects a broader ideological push towards reducing federal oversight and taxation on firearms, aligning with certain interpretations of Second Amendment rights. It signals a potential shift in the balance between federal and state gun laws, with proponents arguing for less federal intervention in gun ownership, while critics inevitably raise concerns about public safety implications.
Now, here's an interesting divergence you mentioned earlier. What about clean energy tax credits? The House wanted to phase them out. What does Graham do?
Right, this is a fascinating contrast. Graham's proposal apparently gives businesses more time to take advantage of some of the clean energy tax credits that were passed during the previous administration, likely referring back to the IRA.
More time. So the opposite of the House approach.
It directly contrasts us with the House bill's explicit phasing out of some of these credits. This indicates a, perhaps, different approach to environmental incentives within the party leadership in the Senate, or at least from the Budget Committee perspective. While the House sought to actively dismantle certain clean energy supports, Graham's version appears aimed more at supporting existing investments or providing a more gradual transition, perhaps acknowledging the economic impact on businesses that have already made plans based on those credits. It could be seen as a strategic move balancing a desire to eventually reduce federal spending in this area with a recognition of current market realities and investments.
Okay, last piece on Graham's version. Taxes. How does his approach compare to the House on individual and business taxes? You mentioned the SALT cap.
Yes. On tax provisions, Graham's Senate bill would maintain the current $10,000 cap on the state and local tax, or SALT-TED deduction.
The $10,000 cap stays. How does that compare to the House?
It's significantly lower than the House's proposed increase. Remember, the House bill proposed raising the cap to $40,000 for eligible married couples filing jointly.
Right. So keeping the lower cap hits taxpayers harder in high-tax states like New York, California, New Jersey.
Disproportionately, yes. That $10,000 cap has been a major point of contention, especially for representatives from those states.
And what about the big picture tax cuts, the TCJA extensions?
This is crucial, and perhaps the most significant difference from the House on taxes. The Senate version, under Graham, would permanently extend the individual tax cuts from Trump's 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It also permanently extends certain business tax deductions, like immediate expensing for research and development costs.
Permanently. The House version only extended these for several years, right? Not permanently.
Exactly. The House version only extended these key measures temporarily, for several years. Graham's version makes them permanent fixtures of the tax code. So what does this all mean for the nation's long-term fiscal health and economic strategy? It's a profound difference.
It really sounds like it. Graham's approach seems to be trying to balance fiscal conservatism, maybe, with the need to garner sufficient support for a comprehensive tax reform vision. But that push for permanent extension, that locks things in.
It absolutely does. The push for permanent extension of the 2017 tax cuts solidifies a very specific long-term conservative tax policy agenda. It comes with much, much greater long-term fiscal implications than the House's temporary extensions. We're talking trillions more in projected revenue loss over the long haul. It suggests a deeper, more entrenched commitment to that 2017 tax reform framework, a vision that will lock in significant revenue reductions for the foreseeable future, shaping the economy and the national debt for decades to come. It reflects a core belief, prevalent in some circles, that these cuts will stimulate sufficient long-term economic growth to eventually pay for themselves, though that remains a debated point. Okay, so if we try to connect all these different threads now, the House bill, Paul's Senate version, Graham's Senate version, and look at the bigger picture, what do we see? We see, I think, a nuanced but broadly consistent trajectory, a move towards reduced federal spending on social programs, definitely, and a significant recalibration of tax policies. However, the specific mechanisms they choose, the severity of the impact on different groups, and the underlying strategic priorities. They differ significantly between the House and these key Senate players. It's like they're all aiming for a broadly similar destination, maybe call it fiscal conservatism or smaller government, but they're using different maps, different vehicles, and different routes to get there. And those different routes impact very different landscapes and populations along the way.
Right. Let's break it down area by area, starting with higher education. The House passed HR-1, as we discussed, proposed really aggressive cuts to student aid Pell Grants, subsidized loans gone, and introduced that institutional risk-sharing model. Truly transformative stuff. What's noteworthy here, looking at the Senate versions from Paul and Graham, our sources don't really detail specific counterproposals or modifications to these higher ed provisions from either senator. It seems like higher education just wasn't the focus of their respective Senate committee revisions. They were zeroed in on the federal workforce or budget items like Medicaid and taxes.
That's right. The lack of focus implies a couple of possibilities. Either the House's original provisions in this area might face less direct, publicly stated opposition from these particular Senate committee leaders. Maybe they broadly agree, or maybe it's just not their fight. Or perhaps the Senate's overall approach to higher education policy within this reconciliation framework is still coalescing behind the scenes, just hasn't been publicly detailed yet by these chairmen. Regardless, if those original House provisions largely remain in whatever final bill emerges, it would represent that significant and potentially transformative shift for millions of students we talked about. It would fundamentally alter the landscape of federal student aid and institutional financial responsibility for years to come. It would be a very strong signal about the future direction of federal involvement, or lack thereof, in higher education funding.
Okay, healthcare. Specifically Medicaid. The House bill imposed work requirements on able-bodied adults but had specifically exempted parents. Senator Graham's proposal, however, expands these requirements to include parents of teenagers. That seems like a direct contradiction, likely leading to more people losing coverage under Graham's plan.
A direct contradiction, yes, showing a differing view on exactly who should be subject to these requirements and potentially lose benefits. And Graham's version also imposes stricter limits on those state provider taxes, that vital funding mechanism for state Medicaid programs, compared to the House's freeze. The House already constrains states by freezing the taxes. Graham's bill goes further by actively cutting how much states can tax providers in many cases. This divergence indicates, perhaps, a deeper intent within the Budget Committee's proposal to reduce federal support for Medicaid overall, regardless of the potential for increased coverage loss and financial strain on states and healthcare providers. It reflects a more aggressive stance on federal disengagement from health coverage responsibilities, effectively pushing more of the financial burden onto states and potentially leading to wider health disparities and increased uncompensated care costs for hospitals.
Now, tax policy. The differences here seem really striking. The House offered that mixed bag. Some individual tax relief, like the child tax credit expansion, but also increased burdens on specific nonprofit sectors, like the expanded endowment tax, while actively moving away from clean energy incentives. It was a diverse package.
Right. Graham's Senate version, conversely, shows a greater emphasis on protecting existing business incentives. It actually gives businesses more time for clean energy tax credits, surprisingly, and it maintains that lower, more restrictive $10,000 SALT cap, hitting individuals in high-tax states harder than the House version would have. But the most significant divergence, and maybe the most defining element of Graham's approach versus the House, is the Senate's push for the permanent extension of the TCJA individual and business tax cuts.
Permanent versus temporary, that's the key.
That is the absolute key difference. The House merely extended these temporarily. Making them permanent, as Graham proposes, has far, far greater long-term fiscal implications, trillions of dollars over the long term. It signifies a deeper, more entrenched commitment to that specific 2017 tax reform framework. It represents a long-term vision for the U.S. tax code that would log in significant revenue reductions for the foreseeable future, impacting the national debt in a profound way. It really reflects a core philosophical belief in supply-side economics driving that push for permanence.
Okay, social programs, focusing on S&AP. Both the House and Graham's Senate version aim to curtail S&AP benefits in significant ways. That seems to signal a bipartisan agreement, or at least a strong intra-party agreement within the majority, on reducing the scope of this particular social safety net. The House bill, remember, expanded work requirements to families with kids as young as 10 and implemented that very hefty 25% state cost sharing on the benefits themselves.
Correct. Graham's Senate proposal caps the state cost sharing at that seemingly less drastic 15%, which, on the surface, might look like a smaller burden for state budgets. However, it paradoxically goes further than the House, as we discussed, by not exempting those families with one working parent and one stay-at-home parent from the work requirements.
Meaning both parents have to meet the rules.
Exactly. Which could put those 2.5 million children at risk. So this could have a more profound and widespread negative impact on certain family structures and overall child well-being. By making it harder for these specific families to maintain benefits, it could force both parents into the workforce prematurely, potentially increasing child care costs or leaving children unsupervised, or push families into greater poverty if they can't meet the requirements. Ultimately increasing food insecurity for millions of children, even if the state cost share percentage looks lower. It's a very subtle but potentially significant difference in who bears the burden of these cuts.
And finally, the federal workforce and civil service. The House version included those broad cuts impacting existing federal employees, changing retirement calculations, increasing contributions. Senator Paul's Senate proposal strategically omitted those specific cuts for current employees and retirees, a clear political move, perhaps, to protect a sensitive group.
A very clear move. But this brings us back to that important question. What did he add in their place? And what does it reveal about his strategic intent? Paul introduced those new burdens specifically for future employees, the higher retirement contributions, that stark choice between paying more or relinquishing merit-based civil service protections. And even more significantly, his version grants the president that virtually unchecked authority for federal government reorganization, and it directly targets federal employee unions financially with taxes and reimbursement requirements.
So it's not just a fiscal adjustment for him.
Not at all. This is a fundamental attempt, it appears, to reduce bureaucratic independence and increase political control over the federal workforce. It aims to reshape the very nature of government service over the long term, potentially leading to that less experienced, more politically aligned federal workforce and a decline in institutional expertise and neutrality. It really speaks to a deeper frustration, evident within some factions of Congress, about the perceived unresponsiveness or independence of the career bureaucracy and a strong desire to make it more directly accountable to political leadership, for better or worse. Hashtag outro good show.
So after this really deep dive, trying to track all these moving parts, what does this all mean? Our journey through HR1, this one big beautiful bill act, reveals an incredibly complex and definitely still evolving legislative landscape. We've seen really significant divergences between that initial House-passed version and these subsequent quite distinct proposals coming out of key Senate committees under Senator Rand Paul and Senator Lindsey Graham. This really feels like a legislative chess match unfolding in real time, with each move reflecting deeply held ideological beliefs, different priorities, and complex strategic calculations.
Absolutely. And what's particularly striking here, I think, is that while both chambers and these key senators seem to aim for substantial fiscal reform through this powerful budget reconciliation process, their actual approaches to achieving those goals and the specific populations who would be most impacted by their choices vary considerably. The legislative journey of H.R. 1 is clearly far from complete. These competing Senate versions necessitate further and likely very intense negotiation and compromise, first within the Senate majority and then potentially back with the House. The big question now becomes, how will these different visions possibly be reconciled? What will the final grand bargain, if there is one, actually look like?
And the stakes are incredibly high. The ultimate form of HR1, whatever it becomes, will have profound and lasting consequences for federal fiscal policy, for the social safety net as we know it, for the accessibility and affordability of higher education, for the very structure and nature of the federal workforce, and for the overall economic landscape of the United States. This isn't just about abstract policy debates in Washington. It's about the very fabric of American life, potentially impacting millions of individuals and families in very direct ways.
Which really raises an important question for you, our listener, to consider as you reflect on this update and watch this unfold. What does this ongoing legislative debate, with all its twists and turns and competing priorities, tell us about the current state of play and the deep divisions within Congress? And perhaps more importantly, how might these proposed changes, regardless of their final form, reshape the very fabric of American life for generations to come? Will these efforts ultimately lead to greater fiscal responsibility, as proponents claim? Or could they deepen existing societal divides and hardships, as critics fear? How will these debates and the final outcome ultimately influence your community, your family, or perhaps even your own future? Lots to think about.
Indeed, a lot to think about, and certainly a story we will continue to follow closely. Thank you for joining us for this in-depth look at the latest developments with HR1. We hope this deep dive has helped you feel more informed and given you plenty to consider.